時間となりましたので、セミナーを開始いたします。本日、座長を務めますのは、九州大学アジア・オセアニア研究教育機構研究推進コーディネーターの田中俊則准教授です。田中先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さん、こんにちは。アジア・オセアニア機構の田中俊則です。本日は4月27日ですね、第47回目のブラウンバックセミナーとなります。あともう少しでゴールデンウィークになります。きっとワクワクされている方も多いんじゃないかなと思います。久しぶりに規制のないゴールデンウィークになりますね。糸キャンパスもツツジが咲き始めて、森もですね、木々の緑も一雨ごとに濃くなっていって、本当に美しい穏やかないい季節になってきました。本日は九州大学留学生センターの野中千里准教授にお越しいただいております。ご発表タイトルは高等教育の国際化における憧れの考察です。皆さんご承知の通り、新型コロナウイルスの影響で留学生の来日が長く制限されていました。私も前任の大学ではですね、留学生の対応が多い部署におりましたので、今日の発表とても楽しみにしています。早速ご発表いただきたいところですが、その前に野中先生の紹介をですね、簡単にさせていただければと思います。野中先生は2004年にハワイ大学広校をご卒業後、2017年にハワイ大学マナー校にて教育基礎学の学位を取得されております。2018年4月より九州大学留学生センターに勤務されており、現在は短期留学受け入れプログラムである Japan in Today's World の教員コーディネーターをされております。研究内容はトランスナショナルな教育現場における言語、人種、民族、国家、社会階級、ジェンダーに関わるアイデンティティ形成についてです。本日の発表は英語で発表されるというふうに私聞いております。ですので、もし日本語でお聞きになりたい方がいらっしゃればですね、通訳ボタンを使ってですね、日本語で聞くようにしていただければと思います。それでは野中先生、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
お願いします。シェアいたします。始めたいと思います。So, thank you, Professor Tanaka, for the introduction, as well as this wonderful opportunity to share my research at the Brownback seminar. I've actually enjoyed some of the previous sessions for both my research and my personal interest, and I want to express gratitude to all of the QAOS team members for their hard work and dedication. As introduced, my name is Chisato Nonaka, and I'm associate professor at the International Student Center of Kyushu University, and I currently serve as a faculty coordinator for the university's one of the largest inbound exchange programs called JTW, or Japan in Today's World. Today, I want to share a little bit about my research focusing on the internationalization or kokusaika of Japanese universities. I'll be using a framework of akogare or desire to discuss some data collected for my project. Just as a side note, higher education or koto kyoiku is the education level that comes after you complete your your high school education. I think it's confusing to some people because even in Japanese, koto kyoiku sounds pretty similar to koto gakko, which is high school. But higher education, in this case, is really, junior colleges, four-year universities, vocational schools, and so forth, that all of which come after you complete high school. I just wanted to make sure that we have the same understanding before I begin my talk. So today I'll start with a background of my research, and then I'll explain my research questions for this project. And I'll introduce theoretical foundations, which some of you may find a little bit boring, but those helped to develop my akogare desire framework for this project. And then I'll briefly share some of the major findings and discussion. And I'll wrap up with a quick conclusion, and we'll share some food for thought, as I believe we have people of different roles, backgrounds and stances in the audience. So I think it'll be great to, if this serves as an open space where all of us can, think ahead in the future of Japanese higher education. And so that being said, I welcome comments, questions, and suggestions in the chat box, as well as at the end of the presentation. So starting with the background. So this graph gives you some idea about the increasing and decreasing financial support provided by the government for Japanese higher education's internationalization efforts since 2008. And so there have been multiple and large international education programs or kokusaika jigyo in Japan, especially since 2008, such as one here, in 2009, a project called Global 30 started, and then a few others in 2011, Reinventing Japan, which was another largely funded project. In 2012, we saw the beginning of promotion of global human resource development. And I think most of us know that since 2014, Kyushu University has been part of this, again, largely funded internationalization projects called Super Global University Project. So based on, the increasing and decreasing funding provided by the government, here are some issues to elaborate. So first, billions of yen or millions in US dollars have been expended annually for these kokusaika policies and projects, but the actual effects remain understudied and unknown. We do hear, from time to time through, world university rankings that such and such universities are doing well or better than their rival universities and so on. But after all, university rankings are simply one of the many assessment tools to understand our performance and progress. And also programs and projects of this nature may be something that we cannot simply quantify the results or effects of. So if so, I wondered, what can I do as an education researcher as well as a classroom teacher at the university? And also another side to this, so the second point here, so in those internationalization policies, English education is always advocated, as if English is the remedy for all. And as much as I myself benefit from having an academic English proficiency, particularly in my current work, I think it's important to use a critical lens to analyze how and why English education is used as a necessary part of Japan's kokusaika efforts. And also within the current research on kokusaika, in the context of Japanese higher education, students' experiences are rarely the central focus. And so that helped me to create this project. So based on the previous backgrounds, these are the two major questions I came up with for my research project. The first one is, how do Japanese university students experience kokusaika at their university? And the second question is, what implications do the students' experiences have for the future of Japanese higher education's kokusaika? So before moving on to the data and analysis for today's presentation, I wanted to share with you the framework that I have developed for my research, the framework of akogare. And akogare, as you may already know, is sometimes translated as desire, but as we also know that akogare is a complex notion that we cannot perhaps perfectly translate it into another language or culture. But akogare has in fact been discussed and studied in foreign language studies as a powerful motivator and a drive for language learners to study and acquire a foreign language. So with that, I wanted to, that as a foundation, I wanted to explain the theoretical foundations that I used to develop my Akogare framework. So I draw from, okay. So the recent research trend in, I use TESOL here, but TESOL is short for Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, kind of similar to ESL or ESOL, TFL, and other language teaching field. But anyways, it's a field that aims to uncover and better understand the learning, teaching, and research experiences of students and teachers. And in recent years, race, gender, ethnicity, class, so on, are the hot topics in TESOL research because they're understood as something that helps us to, I guess, better understand identities of students and teachers alike. So I decided to borrow from that research field. And then if you're familiar with the general field of identity studies, it's a huge field. And so for my research, I use social identity theories as the foundation. And I also use the binary called the Japanese self and the non-Japanese other. When we talk about Japan or Japanese society in comparison to foreign language, foreign cultures, there's almost an unspoken assumption that there is an invisible but enduring divide between Japan and outside of Japan. And so as we can imagine, this binary of Japanese and non-Japanese can be controversial, but it's really important because it's prevalent and widely practiced by the so-called Japanese people. So with that, I have created the framework, but before I show you my framework, and I just want to share with you a working definition of akogare for my research. I've defined akogare as a sentiment in which an individual desires to pursue his or her dreams, whether they be a person or an object, tangible or intangible, that is tantalizingly out of reach from the individual. So if you're already familiar with the term akogare, we know that we can find it everywhere from pop songs to TV dramas to manga, comic books to personal diaries to motivational speeches and so on. And it has somewhat lyrical and romantic undertones. So akogare may be seen frivolous at times, but it's also accepted as a reason for someone's career decision or when you talk about someone you look up to. So with that working definition, finally, this is the framework I've developed. I focus on the concept of the self and other in transnational context, namely the Japanese self and the non-Japanese other. Akogare transpires between the self who desires and the other who is desired. And importantly, akogare is not simply an articulation of one's desire, but I argue that it's creating a space of negotiations where the individual positions the self in relation to the other and all within that person's perceived reality at a given time and place. So the distance between this self and the other in the framework is tantalizingly out of reach, as mentioned here. So, you feel like you can almost touch or reach, and that's what's keeping this sentiment alive and interesting, in my opinion. And so, in other words, you may lose the sense of akogare once you reach the target, whether it be a person or an object. So using that akogare framework, I've collected and analyzed data over the years. And my research initially began in 2013 and it's still ongoing. I've done surveys, interviews, field observations in and outside of Japan. So I have a lot to share, but for today, I'll focus on two specific findings that I think you may find interesting. So here are the two findings from my research that may be of your interest. The first one is the Bieber lookalike fever in Japan. And the other one is beautiful but not Japanese. So let me begin with the first finding. I think most, if not all of you, have heard of the name Justin Bieber. Um, he's a singer from Canada. He started off, his career as a teen idol, but I think he's now established himself as an R&B singer, so to speak. Anyways, when his popularity was on the upswing in late 2000s to early 2010s, we saw lots of teens becoming hysterical over Justin Bieber. And this phenomenon was widespread, so much so that the media began to use the term Bieber Fever to describe the craziness of those hardcore fans. So I borrowed this term Bieber Fever to help explain an interesting case I myself observed while collecting data in Japan. And it involves a student from Hawaii who constantly received a lot of attention from mostly Japanese female students while traveling as a group in Japan. So this type of akogare among Japanese girls towards Western men has been researched in the past in the field of foreign language studies, sociology, and cultural studies. And during my field research trip to Japan with a group of American university students, I witnessed this dreamy gaze of female students towards one American male student in particular. So this student, I'm gonna call him Ryan for now. So he had a light colored eyes, nicely styled hair, and a kind of punk rock clothing, very fitted and fashionable. So we were visiting different schools for field study in Japan, and it quickly became obvious that Ryan was receiving so much attention from Japanese students, especially female students. And Ryan told me that he was confused about the unexpected popularity in Japan because he, quote, had never experienced anything like this my entire life in the US, end quote. So some Japanese students mentioned that Ryan looks like Justin Bieber. So that's also why I decided to name this case the Bieber lookalike fever in Japan. And this phenomenon was a surprise to other American students who were traveling as part of the group too, because Ryan was just a typical, normal, average American student in Hawaii. But once we were in Japan, he was getting so much attention for some reason. So anyways, let me share with you part of my observation notes during the trip to kind of show you the extent of this craze around Ryan in Japan. So in an international understanding class at women's junior college in northern Japan, the instructor introduced the American University group, including myself, to the class and asked us to split into different groups so we can converse with the Japanese students in groups. And I was assigned to a group of 8 female students. And as soon as I joined them, they started to ask about Ryan. So the student one says, "Who's that boy?" And I said, "You mean Ryan?" And the student said, "Yeah, that boy with blue eyes." And the other student said, "How old is he?" And yet another student said, "His eye color is so beautiful." And then student 4 said, "I want to be friends with him. I want to be more than friends with him." And another student said, "Me too." And so I answered, "I'm sure he'd love to be friends with you girls. I think he's into Japanese stuff. I remember him talking about video games." And student 4 said, "I don't mind otaku at all. Do you know if he has a girlfriend?" So I said, "Not sure, maybe. I know he likes music though." And then she said, "Really? We make a perfect couple. I love music, I dance hip hop." And she pulled out her phone to show me pictures of her with her dance crew. And I said, "Nice." And she said, "Can you fix me up with him? Here's my contact." So, this student 4 seemed almost overly passionate about pursuing Ryan. This was, by no means an unusual instance. Out of at least 40 different locations I observed when Ryan traveled with our group, Japanese students, particularly female students, repeatedly and constantly commented on his kakkoi looks. And in some occasions, Japanese professors also acknowledged Ryan's handsomeness and popularity in a joking manner. So for example, when we were trying to make groups for activities in class that we visited, one professor said, "I know all of you want Ryan to be in your group, but there's only one of him." So, in those trips, Ryan was the only visibly Western male among the American students who traveled to Japan with me. And most other students were of like non-white or mixed heritage, for example, Hawaiian, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Portuguese, as you might expect from those, who come from Hawaii. And I have another example, but in the interest of time, I think I'm gonna skip this slide. And then, so I'm just gonna tell you about the second finding. So, speaking of the standards of beauty or attractiveness in Japan, this finding I'll share with you today might offer an interesting dimension to the first one, I think. So this case is about Ariana Miyamoto, who was the first mixed heritage contestant to be awarded the Miss Universe Japan in 2015. And I used Ariana Miyamoto as one of the topics for my surveys and interviews. I wanted to collect different opinions and reactions to Miyamoto being chosen as a representative of Japan for the Miss Universe pageant held in the US. So just quickly to share the backstory of Ariana Miyamoto. She is originally from Nagasaki and she was born to an African-American father and a Japanese mother. And she has mentioned that her childhood wasn't too easy because of her biracial background. And the reason why she decided to compete in the pageant was to raise awareness on diversity and racism in Japan. And in fact, she actually received both support and criticism for being a mixed heritage Miss Universe Japan. So for my research, I asked Japanese university students as well as Japanese and international faculty members about what they think of Miyamoto. And interestingly, none of the Japanese university students or Japanese faculty members knew who Miyamoto was. But on the other hand, several faculty members who were originally from outside of Japan knew exactly who she was. So it's possible that she was covered widely by the overseas media, while maybe not much attention was given to her in the Japanese media. But anyways, when I showed the photos of Miyamoto and explained about the Miss Universe pageant, most students expressed confusion or sometimes uneasiness. They weren't sure if Japan should be represented by a person who doesn't have the so-called Japanese look. So this then has kind of inspired me to explore how the students identify someone as Japanese or not, or someone's Japaneseness, Nihonjin dashita, to be exact. So I followed up with a question: what is Japaneseness or Nihonjin dashita to you? And here are some responses I collected. So one student said it's up to how they perceive themselves. If they feel Japanese, they are Japanese. Another student said being collective may be what makes people Japanese, but not their blood or their faces. Another student said being respectful and polite makes someone Japanese. And another student said, my image of non-Japaneseness is being lighthearted. For example, saying hi to everyone on the street. So here you can see the contradiction to how they responded to the Miyamoto case. On the one hand, the students felt unsure about Miyamoto representing Japan as a Miss Universe Japan because she lacks the Japanese look. But on the other, they feel someone's Japaneseness should be determined by what's inside of the person, like how they feel, rather than how they look on the outside. So I wanted to compare responses with the faculty members' responses on Japaneseness, but I think I'm going to maybe skip this slide too. Most of these responses point to some degree of kind of frustration that they had difficulty perceiving Miyamoto as Japanese, even after realizing that it was wrong to assume someone as Japanese or not Japanese simply by their look. And while some students and faculty members felt this was a good sign that someone like Miyamoto, who doesn't have the traditional Japanese look, won the pageant in Japan, it was also obvious that there is a great gap between what they want to believe as an ideology and what they can believe as a reality. So in other words, ideally, someone's Japaneseness should be determined by how they feel and not how they look. But the reality is that Japaneseness is imagined and practiced in a subtle but powerful manner every day, that it's not so easy for us to simply move away from our traditional ideas about Japaneseness. So as a conclusion, I want to return to the two research questions I posed at the beginning. So the first question was, how do Japanese university students experience kokusaika at their university? And as we saw in the Bieber Fever case, there seems to be a group of students who appear fascinated with the idea of the West, or learning English, and or internationalization in abstract form. But at the same time, I've also met a lot of students during my research who seemed indifferent about anything outside of Japan, or even have an English phobia, that they consciously avoided anything to do with English or international, so to speak. And as I believe kokusaika is not simply a choice, but an after the fact reality of Japanese higher education, it's important for us to, I think, target and engage students of all abilities and interests when we plan educational activities and opportunities on campus. And the second question I had posed was, what implications do their experiences have for the future of Japanese higher education's kokusaika? And through the case of Ariana Miyamoto, we saw that an idea of Japaneseness is uniformly shared by students and faculty members as well, often regardless of their nationality or backgrounds. So this idea of Japaneseness is really strong and powerful, that it seems to almost overpower the ideal and newly emerging sense of Japaneseness, where a person such as Miyamoto is chosen to represent Japan. So what can we do? We, as in faculty members, staff members, university students, as well as parents and community members. And since most of us here today are part of Kyushu University, or for those of you joining from outside of Kyushu University are part of the larger international education community, I want to close my presentation with some food for thought. So one small step we can take as part of the community is perhaps being more serious about the existing diversity that we already see, hear, and have around us every day. We live in this day and age that diversity is no longer like a fairy tale, abstract, utopian dream, but a hard fact reality that we need to accept and embrace. And in my research, I use the term multiplicity to highlight the sense of plurality that is often undermined in current Japanese society, and to visualize and amplify this sense of multiplicity among us. What we can do is to pay attention to the different and multiple voices around us, because voice, as shown in my research and many others, has created a powerful and legitimate space to share stories and experiences. So to keep us thinking and inspired beyond this presentation, as a final note, I want to share with you the following statement made by one of my study participants, who is an American female professor who teaches in Japan and has lived in Japan for over 20 years. So she said, those who would make the claim that they are Japanese should be allowed to do so, because there is a growing population of people living in Japan who have a variety of experiences of living within Japan, living outside of Japan, having parents from a variety of different backgrounds, but they claim their central identity is being Japanese. So the more I hear about this, the more it makes sense to me that it's not something outsiders can say. Ideally, it boils down to how the individual wants to live their lives or claim, their identities. So I don't think that's where things are in Japan yet. To me, ideally, that's what eventually I think is going to have to be recognized. We're at a point in most nation states, I guess, throughout the world, that these really simple labels of connecting ethnicity, nationality, citizenship, all of that doesn't fit anymore. So we need to talk, voice. I think it's only through telling these personal stories that people start to realize it's not that simple. So thank you for listening, and I welcome questions and comments.
はい、ありがとうございました。Thank you very much, Professor Nonaka. And これから、Q&A セッションが10分ほどあります。質問のある方はですね、このチャットボックスに書いていただければ、私が適宜ピックアップしたいと思っています。今日のご発表、この国際化の中でですね、留学生の数とか、例えば英語で提供される講義の数といった、そういった数量的なものっていうのは、統計とか見てですね、出ると思うんですが、今回その学生というところを見て、質的なところをお話しいただいたというふうに思います。一つ来てますね、コメント。ちょっと読ませていただきます。英語ですが、I find little connection between your framework Akogare and the conclusion. Could you specify how Akogare sentiments characterize the student's experience of 国際化?
Very good point, indeed. I actually created this framework to kind of analyze data and collect data. So I think the framework, how do I say? It's not a theorization of what data has explained, but rather than kind of a framework that I try to better understand the data I have collected, if that makes sense to you.
いかがでしょう。ちょっとこの場がチャットがうまくいかないかもしれませんが、例えば最初の方のビーバーフィーバーのやつは憧れの話っていうのがすごく関わってくるのかなと。その次の、宮本さんだった宮本エリアナさん、これは憧れの枠組みでいうとどういうふうにここは解釈するイメージになるでしょう。
I think I did talk about this in my book as well. So there is a group of students who seem to have akugare towards something international and foreign. So there's like this weird, how do you say, what do I say? Kind of disconnect between what they aspire to be and what they want to be, but then at the same time, when those who have acquired towards something international or foreign, they don't want to how do I say, take the risk of losing their Japaneseness by transforming themselves completely non-Japanese, if that makes sense to you.
では次の質問行かせてください。スライドの中で、その人はどう生きたいか、アイデンティティをどう必要したいかに尽きるけれど、日本ではまだそういう状況にないっていうのが印象的だった。 で話し合うこととか、声を上げていくことは重要だという点、私も同意なんですが、そのような具体的な場であるとか、機会、ご存知でしたら共有いただけますでしょうか。ですね。
So I guess as researchers, publishing is one way to kind of raise awareness. And I think as a classroom teacher at the university too, I try to bring these topics, even share some of my research in my class to kind of facilitate a dialogue. And the classes that I teach have like a mix of international and Japanese students. So I know it's very small scale, but those are kind of the opportunities that we can think of within the campus where, you know, students of different backgrounds and experiences can share their voices through that way. And I know that, you know, my classes, I mean, if you're not taking my class, you won't have the opportunity, but I'm seeking different opportunities. And I'm actually working on a project to open like an international lounge where students can, of different backgrounds can come and just have a chat and so on.
はい。じゃあ、いくつか来ているので、あと2つ取り上げたいと思います。憧れの考察のためにどのような研究手法を使っていらっしゃるでしょうか。インタビューやアンケートをすることで学生の声を分析するのが主でしょうか。また他の手法も使っていらっしゃるでしょうかという質問が来ています。
So ideally, I wanted to use a mixed method. So, you know, have kind of a quantitative as well as qualitative data. But for now, I have focused more on the qualitative side of the data. I think there are many different ways to even to revisit the data I have collected, to re-examine and find different conclusions and findings. But for now, yeah, I do focus more on the voice aspect of the data that I have collected.
まあ、主にインタビュー、アンケートはというよりはインタビューがメインだということですね。はい、ありがとうございます。次は、コメントかもしれない。ちょっと読み上げてみましょう。I'm 100% white, but people have told me my personality is very Japanese, and some people have even thought I was half Japanese because they said the way I carry myself seemed very Japanese, and yet at the same time they still acknowledge that I can't be acknowledged as a true Japanese. I thoughtすいません、途中から声がちっちゃくなってしまいましたが。どちらかというとコメントでしたね。これクエスチョンというわけですね。
Yeah, that's really something that, you know, came up repeatedly during the process of my data collection as well. And actually, the last voice I have shared with you in this presentation, she herself is like a ethnically Japanese person, but has lived in Japan for a long time, but was born and raised in America. So she shared with me kind of the frustration that she has perhaps lived longer in Japan than in the US, but she still is seen as non-Japanese. Even though she looks Japanese, she speaks Japanese perfectly, her husband's Japanese, she actually makes like the traditional umeboshi herself, she farms, she does everything Japanese, more so than maybe I have. But somehow she felt frustrated that people around her, you know, continue to see her as non-Japanese. So that sort of experiences seem very common among people in transnational, you know, context.
ありがとうございます、フィードバック。最後にちょっと時間をしてますが、1個だけ質問読み上げます。From your perspective, how should the current policy on internationalization be changed to better achieve the goals nationwide at Kyushu University level? これは結構大事な質問な気がします。
I think we can't rely on the policies anymore. I'm starting to realize, you know, when I was doing my research, I was an outsider. I was, I belonged to an American university and, just a graduate student. And I didn't understand how, really Japanese universities function. But after I was hired here and, being here for several years, I realized how difficult it is. Sometimes the policies are not really translated the way they intentionally meant to. And so I think even the policies with, really good intentions are not really, realized at the reality, at the level of institution. So I'm trying to think maybe there are other ways to how do I say? There should be other approaches rather than just trying to change the policies or looking into the policies, but there are other approaches that we need to take.
If you could, could you elaborate just, how in 1 minute rather than the policy, as you said?
So I think there are a lot of grassroots activities and programs. I was just reading like an email that was sent out today from Itoshima, and they seem to have like a community project that involves internationalization, but also in other elements as well. Like I think it was green project or something. So I'm thinking maybe we can't just focus on the policies to internationalize or just focus solely on internationalization, but there should be other elements in a policy or programs. And it doesn't have to be like a top-down kind of policies or programs, but at the practitioner levels, there are those grassroots, I guess, activities, they should be encouraged more, if that makes sense. And I know that Kyushu University has a lot of student-led clubs and they do events and everything. So all of that, I think, can kind of collaborate with each other to be a little more meaningful than a top-down policies.
ありがとうございます。草の根の活動が大事だということですね。すごく大切なメッセージだと思います。ご発表ありがとうございました。
野中先生、田中先生、ありがとうございました。最後に事務局より2点ご案内させていただきます。まず、次回のブラウンバックセミナーのご案内です。次回は再来週5月11日水曜日の12時10分より、九州大学附属図書館附設教材開発センター教授、岡田義弘先生より、教育向け3次元グラフィックスアプリケーションの開発と題し、講演を実施いたします。詳細はホームページをご覧ください。